The rolling hills of the Palouse in Moscow, Idaho, are defined by their rhythmic, undulating beauty, a landscape that feels ancient and undisturbed. For the 25,000 residents of this tight-knit college town, safety wasn't just an expectation. It was a baseline reality. But on the morning of November 13, 2022, that reality was shattered within the walls of a gray, three-story house sitting on a dead-end street at 1122 King Road. This home was a hub of laughter and youthful ambition, housing 6 roommates who were navigating the best years of their lives. Among them were Maddie Mogan and Kaylee Goncalves, both 21-year-old seniors. Their bond was the kind of friendship that defined the term soulmates. They had been inseparable since 6th grade, moving through the milestones of puberty, high school graduation, and college together. Kaylee was the fiery adventurer, recently having purchased a Range Rover and planning a move to Austin, Texas, to start a high-tech marketing career. Maddie was the grounding force, known for her warmth and her signature pink aesthetic. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. On the 2nd floor lived Xana Kernadal, a 20-year-old marketing major from Post Falls, Idaho. Xana was described by her family as unstoppable, a girl who worked hard and loved harder. That night, her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, also 20, was staying over. Ethan was a triplet from Mount Vernon, Washington, a young man whose stature, standing 6'4", was matched only by his reputation for kindness and his love for sports. These 4 individuals represented the heartbeat of the University of Idaho. They were not just names on a transcript. They were daughters, sons, siblings, and friends whose futures were bright enough to light up the dark Idaho winters. The timeline of their final hours is a chilling map of normalcy. Maddie and Kaylee had spent the evening at a local bar called the Corner Club before stopping at a grub truck food vendor in the downtown area. At 1:41 a.m., Twitch stream footage showed them laughing and ordering pasta, looking like any other students on a Saturday night. They caught a ride home from a private party, arriving at King Road at 1:56 a.m. Meanwhile, Xana and Ethan had been at the Sigma Chi fraternity house just a short walk away, returning home around 1:45 a.m. By 4 a.m., the house was quiet, save for Xana, who was recorded as being active on TikTok on her phone at 4:12 a.m., and the 2 surviving roommates who had returned earlier and were asleep on the 1st floor. The violence that followed was not just sudden. It was concentrated and overwhelming. Between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m., an intruder entered the residence. According to the later released probable cause affidavit, one of the surviving roommates, identified as DM, was awakened at approximately 4 a.m. by what she thought was Kaylee playing with her dog, Murphy, in an upstairs bedroom. Shortly after, she heard someone say, "There's someone here." DM looked out of her door but saw nothing. She opened her door a second time when she heard crying coming from Xana's room. She heard a male voice say something to the effect of, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." When she opened her door a third time, she stood in a frozen shock phase, as a figure clad in black clothing and a mask that covered the person's mouth and nose walked past her. He was described as a male, not particularly muscular but athletically built with bushy eyebrows. He walked toward the back sliding glass door, leaving DM locked in her room in a state of terror. The scene discovered the next morning was beyond the comprehension of the first responders. Madison and Kaylee were found in the same bed on the 3rd floor. Xana and Ethan were found in Xana's room on the 2nd floor. The weapon used was a fixed-blade knife, likely a K-bar style, which left wounds so deep they were described by the coroner as extensive. The most critical piece of evidence was found almost immediately, a tan leather knife sheath lying on the bed next to Maddie's right side. On the snap of that sheath, investigators found a single source of male DNA, a microscopic signature left behind by a killer who thought he had been meticulous. As the investigation began, the town of Moscow was paralyzed. For 6 weeks, the police department, under immense pressure, maintained a gag order on specific details. They asked the public for information regarding a 2011 to 2013 white Hyundai Elantra that had been seen on neighborhood security cameras during the window of the murders. This car had made 4 passes by the house before stopping at 4:04 a.m. and speeding away at 4:20 a.m. While the community held vigils and parents pulled their children out of classes early for Thanksgiving break, the FBI was quietly utilizing investigative genetic genealogy. They took the DNA from the knife sheath and uploaded it to public databases, building a family tree that branched out across the country. The trail led them to the Pennsylvania home of a man named Michael Kohberger, but the focus was on his son, Bryan. Bryan Kohberger was a 28-year-old PhD student in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Washington State University in Pullman, a mere 8 miles, a 10-minute drive, from the crime scene. He was a man who spent his days studying the motives of criminals and the forensic techniques used to catch them. He was a man who, just weeks after the murders, sat in his classrooms and engaged in discussions about the very nature of crime, all while the DNA he allegedly left on a leather strap was being processed in a federal lab. As the winter progressed, the psychological weight on the town of Moscow grew. The King Roadhouse was surrounded by yellow tape and guarded by officers 24/7. The public was desperate for an arrest, unaware that the suspect was currently driving across the country with his father to spend the holidays in the Poconos. The tension between the normal life Bryan was projecting and the forensic reality closing in on him was a ticking clock. The world was looking for a psycho killer hiding in the shadows, not realizing that the suspect was a doctoral candidate who was currently helping his family prepare for Christmas. As the FBI shadowed Bryan Kohberger across state lines from Idaho to Pennsylvania, his sister Mel was noticing a strange shift in her brother's behavior. A shift that began with a bizarre reaction to a simple kitchen accident involving a piece of foil and a drop of blood. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. To the world, the name Bryan Kohberger was a mystery yet to be revealed, but inside the Kohberger family home in the Chestnut Hill Township of Pennsylvania, he was a son and a brother who had finally found his footing. This story is not about the crime scene in Idaho, but about the psychological dissonance within a family home 2,500 miles away. It is the story of how a family can look at a monster every day and see only a person they love. For Mel Kohberger, Bryan's older sister, the return of her brother for the 2022 winter break was supposed to be a celebration of his academic success. Bryan had recently completed his first semester as a PhD student at Washington State University. He was the success story of the family, a man who had clawed his way back from the brink of a devastating heroin addiction that had nearly destroyed his life and his family's peace years prior. The history of that addiction is a crucial layer to understanding the family's perspective. Mel remembered the darker days when Bryan was a teenager, a time marked by the typical, gut-wrenching betrayals of substance abuse. At one point, Bryan had even stolen Mel's cell phone to sell it for drug money. The situation had become so dire that their father, Michael, had taken the agonizing step of calling the police on his own son, fearing that if the law didn't intervene, the heroin would. They had watched him hit rock bottom, and then they had watched him climb out. He had become a vegan, a fitness enthusiast, and a scholar. By the time he sat down for Christmas dinner in December 2022, he was, in their eyes, a man who had conquered his demons. This history of overcoming created a powerful psychological shield for the family. They were so proud of the man he had become that they were functionally blinded to the man he was becoming. During that 2022 holiday season, the contrast between the cozy family atmosphere and the gruesome reality of the Idaho investigation was staggering. While the FBI was secretly tracking Bryan's white Hyundai Elantra across the country, the Kohbergers were engaging in quiet family rituals. Mel described an idyllic childhood that they tried to replicate in adulthood. Their parents would put blankets on the deck, and they would all lie back to look at the stars, discussing philosophy and psychology. Bryan and Mel shared a deep interest in the human mind, often engaging in long, intellectual conversations about how people think and why they behave the way they do. This shared bond made the subsequent revelations even more of a shatter for Mel. However, there were cracks in the mask during that final visit. Mel recalled a specific moment that felt off at the time but became chilling in retrospect. While cleaning up after a meal, Mel accidentally cut her finger on a sharp piece of aluminum foil. It was a minor injury, but she noted that Bryan appeared strangely freaked out and visibly uncomfortable at the sight of her blood. Despite his apparent revulsion, he helped her bandage the finger. At that very moment, according to the forensic timeline, the blood of 4 victims had already been found in his car and on the knife sheath he had allegedly left behind. This revulsion to a sister's small cut stood in haunting contrast to the calculated, high-volume violence of the King Road murders. The most surreal aspect of this period was the family's awareness of the Idaho case itself. Because Bryan was living just minutes away from the crime scene, Mel was genuinely terrified for his safety. She followed the news of the Moscow murders with the same dread as the rest of the country. In a conversation that now feels like a scene from a horror film, Mel warned her brother about the killer. She told him, "Bryan, you are running outside at night, and this psycho killer is on the loose. You have to be careful. Lock your doors." Bryan didn't flinch. He thanked her for her concern and promised her he would stay safe. He was playing the role of the potential victim while standing as the perpetrator. Even the evidence staring them in the face was rationalized away. When the Moscow Police Department released the request for information on a white Hyundai Elantra, the family briefly discussed it. They knew Bryan drove that exact make and model. However, the police alert specifically asked for a 2011 to 2013 model. Bryan's car was a 2015. To a family desperate to protect their success story, that 2-year discrepancy was an ironclad alibi. They weren't looking for reasons to suspect him. They were looking for reasons to believe in him. The psychological concept at play here is identity fracture. For Mel and her parents, there were 2 Bryans. There was the brother who was socially awkward, perhaps a bit abrasive due to his level 1 autism, Asperger's, but fundamentally a good kid who loved psychology and his family. Then there was the figure the media was beginning to describe, a calculated predator. On December 30th, 2022, these 2 identities collided. The Pennsylvania State Police and the FBI moved in on the Kohberger home in a late-night raid. They smashed windows and deployed flashbangs, a violent end to the family's quiet holiday. Mel's sister, Amanda, was the one who broke the news to her. Mel's initial reaction wasn't suspicion. It was total disbelief. She asked Amanda what the charges were, and when Amanda said, "the Idaho murders," Mel's brain initially rejected it as a prank or a colossal mistake by the authorities. She thought of the vegan cookies their mother had just baked for him. She thought of the games they had played. But then, a wave of nausea hit her. The frozen shock the roommate DM had felt in the hallway at King Road was now being mirrored by the killer's own sister in Pennsylvania. The arrest didn't just take Bryan away. It turned the Kohberger family into collateral victims. They were suddenly thrust into a global spotlight, not for anything they had done, but because of who they were related to. This is what forensic psychiatrists call courtesy stigma, the shame that attaches to the innocent family of a notorious criminal. The public began to ask, what did they know? How could they not see it? The father, Michael, was scrutinized for driving across the country with Bryan in the Elantra after the murders. Had he seen something? Was he helping his son dispose of evidence? The prosecution later clarified that the family had no helpful information for the case, suggesting they were truly, tragically in the dark. As Bryan was extradited back to Idaho to face 4 counts of first-degree murder, the family retreated into a wall of silence. They were trapped in a liminal space. They were the family of a man who had confessed to nothing, but whose DNA was allegedly at the center of a bloodbath. They were forced to reconcile the brother who bandaged a finger with the man who stood accused of a crime so heinous it had changed the laws and the psyche of an entire state. While the Kohberger family began their long descent into public infamy, the legal system in Idaho was preparing a mountain of evidence that would eventually force Bryan to drop the mask entirely, but not before a series of courtroom revelations that would paint a much darker picture of his behavior toward women than his sister ever knew. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. As the 2022 fall semester progressed at Washington State University, Bryan Kohberger was not just a student of criminology. He was becoming the primary case study for a terrified department. While his sister Mel saw a brother who had conquered his past, the women of WSU were experiencing a man who seemed to be unraveling in real time. This part of the story moves away from the quiet success Bryan projected in Pennsylvania and into the documented, high-alert environment of Pullman, Washington. The red flags were not subtle. They were so pervasive that faculty members and students had begun keeping a literal tally of his behavior. In the hallways of the WSU Criminology Department, Kohberger's reputation was toxic. Public records released in 2025 revealed that at least 13 separate formal complaints had been filed against him. Female graduate students described an intense, unsettling stare that felt predatory. He didn't just walk through the halls, he hovered. One professor recounted an incident where Kohberger physically blocked the door to an office where female students were working, refusing to move until the professor intervened to let the women escape. The behavior was so targeted toward women that graduate students created a whiteboard tally specifically to track his outbursts and the number of times he would belittle or cut off female instructors during presentations. The academic work he was producing was equally disturbing. Kohberger's research didn't just focus on the law, it focused on the emotions of the predator. He authored a paper on sexual burglary, a niche field of study involving intruders who break into homes not for profit, but for the thrill of a non-consensual encounter or the theft of intimate items. Chillingly, a female graduate student at WSU reported a break-in at her apartment during the same window where only perfume and underwear were stolen, a signature of the very sexual burglary Kohberger was obsessively researching. One faculty member's warning was prophetic. She told her colleagues, "Mark my word, I work with predators. If we give this man a PhD, in 10 years we will hear that he is stalking and sexually abusing his students." Beyond the university walls, the digital forensics recovered from Kohberger's devices after his arrest painted a portrait of a man submerged in violent fantasy. Investigators found that he had downloaded detailed case files on more than 20 notorious serial killers, including Danny Rolling, the Gainesville Ripper, who had famously murdered students in their homes with a K-bar knife. Even more damning were the recovered search terms. Despite using VPNs and incognito browsing, forensics experts retrieved a history of graphic searches including sleeping, passed out, voyeur, and forced. These weren't the searches of a student studying crime. They were the preparations of a man seeking a target. The forensic link to the King Road house was anchored by more than just DNA. Cell tower data revealed that Kohberger's phone had pinged in the area of 1122 King Road at least 12 times between August and November 2022. All of these pings occurred in the late night or early morning hours, a pattern of stalking that suggested he was learning the rhythms of the house. On the night of the murders, his phone went dark at 2:47 a.m. and didn't reconnect until 4:48 a.m., a digital blackout that coincided perfectly with the window of the killings. When it did ping again, it showed him traveling a winding, backroad route back to Pullman, an apparent attempt to avoid the license plate readers on the main highway. Perhaps the most haunting behavioral shift occurred after the murders. A fellow student noticed that the normally tech-obsessed Kohberger suddenly stopped bringing his cell phone to class. He became disheveled, his academic performance plummeted, and he remained unervingly silent whenever the Moscow murders were discussed in class, except for one occasion. When the topic of whether the killer would be caught came up, Kohberger offered a cold, clinical opinion. Maybe it was just a one-and-done type of thing. By late 2024, the legal standing silent tactic was failing. The prosecution's evidence was a tidal wave. The DNA on the knife sheath, which matched Bryan's father via a Q-tip found in the Pennsylvania trash, the white Elantra caught on camera, and the Amazon records showing he had purchased a K-bar knife and sheath with a gift card months earlier. Faced with the possibility of the death penalty, the meticulous criminology student made one final calculation. On July 2nd, 2025, Bryan Kohberger stood in an Idaho courtroom and admitted to the unthinkable. He didn't just plead guilty. He confirmed the premeditated nature of the murders of Maddie, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan. But as the courtroom prepared for his final sentencing, a new mystery emerged. A small piece of paper with a hand-drawn heart appeared on the defense table. The world assumed it was a message of cold defiance from the killer, but the truth about who drew it and why would reveal the final, tragic rupture within the Kohberger family. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. On July 23, 2025, the air inside the Latah County courtroom was thick with a grief that 3 years of legal proceedings had failed to dull. This was the final act of a tragedy that had begun in a house on King Road and ended in a sterile room of law and order. For the families of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, this was the day the monster was formally discarded by society. Bryan Kohberger, the man who had spent years as a student of the law, now stood as its ultimate subject. He sat at the defense table, his expression as inscrutable and flat as it had been since the day of his arrest. But as the cameras panned the room, a small, jarring detail caught the eye of the public. A piece of paper sitting directly in front of Kohberger with a hand-drawn heart sketched in dark ink. To the thousands watching the live stream, the heart felt like a final insult. A cold, mocking gesture from a man who had shown no remorse for tearing the hearts out of 4 families. Speculation ran wild that Kohberger was taunting the victims. However, the truth was revealed through the later testimony and interviews of his sister, Mel. The dark heart was not his, it was hers. Mel had drawn the heart and passed it to the defense team to be placed where her brother could see it. It was a desperate, quiet signal from a sister who was drowning in identity fracture. She wanted him to know that despite the 4 counts of first-degree murder, despite the blood on his hands, he was still the brother she had looked at the stars with. It was a symbol of a love that had become a prison for those who still felt it. The victim impact statements that followed were a visceral reminder of what that love had cost others. The courtroom heard from the Goncalves family, who spoke of Kaylee's missing presence at the dinner table and the hollowed-out lives of her siblings. They spoke of Maddie and Kaylee as a singular unit of light that had been extinguished together. Ethan Chapin's family, the triplets whose bond had been physically severed by a knife, spoke of a triplet-sized hole in their universe. Xana's family described a girl who was the glue of her friend group, a girl who fought for her life until her very last breath. These families didn't just lose their children. They lost the futures those children represented. The weddings, the grandchildren, the simple joy of a Sunday morning phone call. Judge Hyper did not mince words as he delivered the finality of the law. He sentenced Bryan Kohberger to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. There would be no appeals based on rehabilitation, no leniency for his academic background, and no mercy for his autism diagnosis. The judge noted that while Kohberger's sister blamed his flat effect on his level 1 autism, the law looked at his actions, the 12 times he stalked the house, the digital blackout of his phone, and the precision of the kills. The sentence ensured that Kohberger would never again see the stars of the Palouse or the porch of his parents' home. He was a man who had studied the emotions of predators until he became one, and now he would spend the rest of his natural life in a cage. The impact on the Kohberger family has been a slow-motion collapse. Mel Kohberger, once an aspiring mental health counselor, found her own career and identity consumed by her brother's shadow. In her interview with the New York Times, she described the scarlet letter of her last name. She told the story of her father, Michael, a man who had once been so proud of his son's sobriety that he drove him across the country, now living as a recluse, haunted by the what-ifs. Did he notice the cleaning of the car? Did he see the tension in Bryan's shoulders as they crossed the Idaho-Washington border? Mel admitted that the suspicion directed at her family was a trauma of its own, a courtesy stigma that suggested they were somehow complicit in his darkness. Today, Mel lives in a state of perpetual mourning. She keeps the names of Maddie, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan in her digital calendar. Every year, on the anniversaries of their deaths and on their birthdays, her phone chimes to remind her of the lives her brother stole. It is her way of bearing a portion of the cross. On Bryan's birthday in November, the family still makes a cake, and Mel blows out the candles for him. It is a haunting image, a family celebrating the birth of a man who is the reason 4 other families are visiting graves. Mel described this as a living nightmare, where you are victimized but not really a victim. The house at 1122 King Road is gone now, demolished in late 2023 to prevent it from becoming a shrine for true crime tourists. In its place, the University of Idaho plans a healing garden, a space of life, growth, and memory. But the story of Bryan Kohberger remains a terrifying case study in the mask of sanity. It serves as a reminder that the most dangerous predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the brother who helps you bandage a cut, the student who sits in the front row of a criminology class, and the son who eats vegan cookies at Christmas. The dark heart remains the final symbol of this case. A symbol of a love that can't let go, and a darkness that can never be forgiven. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, empathy, and respect for those who can no longer speak for themselves. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button and comment your thoughts below. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.